Thank you very much. Thank you, Roger. Thank you to the Middle East Institute. Before I start, I want to say how glad I am that no one is using any PowerPoint. Before I came to Washington, I was told, Peter, you must use PowerPoint, otherwise no one will listen to you in Washington, D.C. And I can tell you, in fact, I was just getting back from a conference in San Francisco with internet entrepreneurs, some of the biggest names in the business. Half of them were not using PowerPoint. The other half, who were using absolutely terrible, atrocious PowerPoints. No animation, no pictures, lots of text. And I thought, if those giants of the information revolution are not using PowerPoint, I should do the same. So there's no PowerPoint. The topic I want to, thank you. That was easy. The topic I want to talk about is something that has captured the imagination of policymakers from Riyadh to Washington, D.C., to the extent that some of them believe that they have found the silver bullet in the fight against insurgents and terrorists, and that's de-radicalization and disengagement programs. For those of you who do not know what I'm talking about, de-radicalization or disengagement programs are in essence rehabilitation programs. They happen usually in prisons. They target insurgents and terrorists who've been captured, try to convince these people to abandon armed force. They help them reintegrate into society. And my center did a study on the effectiveness and on the functioning of these programs. We studied 8 of these programs. Not all of our case studies were in the Middle East, but the majority were. There are some countries such as Singapore and the Philippines outside of the Middle East who are running these programs, but the majority of countries who are running these programs are based in the Middle East. And our sample included arguably the most sophisticated program, that in Saudi Arabia, that many of you will have heard about, and arguably the least sophisticated and least successful program, the one that was running in Yemen until about five years ago. And what I want to talk about in the next 10 minutes is what we found out. Now, first we looked at how these programs work. What are the core elements? What are the key underlying dynamics? In other words, if any of you wanted to construct a de-radicalization program, what kinds of things would you have to include in order to make it work? And we believe that there are 5 ingredients, 5 key elements that are parts of every successful and good de-radicalization program. First, a mix of different kinds of programming. You will have to have some sort of religious and ideological re-education, deconstructing key concepts that have been misunderstood, arguably, and reconstructing them in a more productive way in the minds of the participant. But typically, some of the good programs are combining this sort of religious and ideological re-education with vocational training, offering them not just a re-education about Islam, but also some of the skills that will provide them with the opportunity to make a living after they have been released. A second ingredient are what we call credible interlocutors. Now, these are people that look after prisoners throughout the duration of the program. They have to know their stuff, obviously. They need to be respected by the prisoners, either because of their religious knowledge or because, as in the case of the Philippines, for example, they are former insurgents themselves. In either case, what's really important about the people that are dealing and interacting with prisoners is that they have the ability to relate to these people. In Saudi, for example, even if you are an incredible authority on Islam, you will not be allowed to interact with prisoners unless you have proven your ability to establish what they call brotherly relationships, to relate to people and their needs. Third ingredient, good programs are all focused on prisoners' transition from prison back into society. From day one, they will, in essence, start preparing prisoners for the day of their release. On the one hand, by providing them with skills, I already mentioned that, but also, and importantly, by re-establishing the links to their families, which many of them had lost when it became obvious that they were engaged in armed violence. In fact, in the case of Saudi, for example, many of their families abandoned them. And family reconciliation, therefore, is incredibly important because it means that on the day they will be released from prison, there is a positive influence waiting outside of the prison walls rather than a negative one. That leads me to fourth ingredient, the next point, which is, more broadly speaking, that all good programs are about locking people into commitments. They're about increasing the social, material, psychological cost of going back to insurgency. So it doesn't stop with family reconciliation, which is just one layer of commitment. Tribal reconciliation is almost as important. In Saudi, tribes will have to vouch for a prisoner's good behavior. In Saudi, for example, but also in other cases, prisoners are provided with jobs, apartments, cars, and in some cases, they are prompted or they are provided with the ultimate commitment, namely a wife. All that is about making sure that when they are released from prisons, they have so much to lose that it would be almost irrational to go back to terrorism and insurgency. You'd lose your family, your tribe would be against you, security services would be chasing you once more, you'd lose your wife, your apartment, your job, and your car. That's a lot to give up, and that's exactly the point of the program. Final ingredient are, of course, material incentives, and I've mentioned some of these already. Material incentives are arguably the most controversial aspect of these programs because it looks like you're rewarding people for engaging in terrorism. Yet they are important, but they are not decisive on their own. In fact, all the programs which we have studied have relied to some extent on money and material incentives, but those that relied on money and material incentives alone were largely unsuccessful. Money and material incentives only work if they are part of that broader idea of creating commitments and locking people into obligations that they find hard to get out of. Money and material incentives are not likely to be successful if deployed on their own, as they were, for example, more or less in the Philippines. So there you have it, 5 ingredients: mix of programming, credible interlocutors, a focus on reintegration and aftercare, creating multiple commitments and material incentives as part of a strategy to create commitment. So you can go off and do your own program now. Good luck. Before you do so, however, I want to give you 2 warnings, which may also come back to the point of these programs being a silver bullet, which I believe they are not. The first point is that de-radicalization programs cannot really be studied in isolation of the conflicts in which they are being implemented. A lot of people are now studying these programs and trying to find metrics. In Washington, it's all about metrics all the time. Metrics as to what makes these programs successful. I think it's fatally flawed to look at these programs in isolation from the sort of social and political environment in which they're being implemented. Take, for example, Iraq. Most people believe that the program that was run in Iraq in 2007, 2008 was a big success. And undoubtedly, and David knows more about this than I do, undoubtedly perhaps it was. But I'd also argue that the very same program that was run in Iraq in 2007-8, the exact same program, using the exact same measures, would have produced different outcomes had it been run in 2005. And the reason is, of course, the political situation in Iraq was completely different. 2005, Iraq was on the brink of civil war, insurgency was gaining momentum, Sunni tribes were still opposed to the American presence, and people would have been sent back into hostile communities. In 2007-8, situation had, of course, been turned around, and people were being sent back into communities that were actually supporting the effort that was going on as part of the program. So the exact same program implemented in the same country at a different point in time would have produced a different outcome. Political momentum plays an important role. And my final point relates to this point, namely that it is quite clear that these programs, however good and sophisticated they are as programs, are not a solution in and by themselves. A DRAD program cannot solve a conflict and would be foolish to think so. They are not a substitute for other means of conflict resolution. They always need to be embedded in a wider strategy. They need to be combined also with sometimes harder and perhaps more traditional counterterrorism and counterinsurgency measures. And I'm saying this not because I think you are naive, but because I'm hearing that a lot in my own continent in Europe and at the United Nations, for example, people speaking about these programs as a substitute to some of the more traditional counterinsurgency measures. That's why in my own country, in Germany, people were so enthusiastic to give money for the emerging program in Afghanistan because they see it as a substitute for sending more troops. And it's not. DRAD programs make a difference, but they rarely make a difference on their own. They have to be sophisticated, well constructed, of course, but they also need political momentum and they need to be embedded in a wider strategy. Just having a program is necessary, but very rarely it is sufficient. Thank you.